people moving, conversations overlapping, the low hum of travel in the background. But something is different that day. There are cameras waiting, reporters positioned. Law enforcement is preparing to escort someone through the terminal, the kind of situation that usually ends with a few questions, a few photos, and then everyone goes home. Except this time, someone else is waiting too. Not a reporter, not a police officer, just a man, standing quietly, watching, blending in so completely that no one gives him a second look. And that's what makes what happens next so unsettling. Because there's no shouting, no warning, no visible anger, just a single decision made in a fraction of a second that would be replayed on television over and over again, forcing millions of people to ask themselves the same question. Not what happened. That part is clear. The real question is much harder. The kind of question that doesn't go away when the video ends. Because once you understand the full story, you don't just watch this moment, you judge it. And whether you realize it or not, you also judge the man behind it. But before we get there, before we break down the exact second that changed everything, you need to understand who that man was. Because nothing about him fits what you're probably imagining right now. Before his name was ever mentioned on the news, Gary Plauché was the kind of man people pass every day without a second thought. He wasn't famous, he wasn't dangerous. He wasn't even the type of person anyone would describe as unpredictable. He was a working-class father in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, living a life built on routine, responsibility, and quiet stability. The kind of man who woke up early, went to work, came home, and did what needed to be done without asking for recognition. No headlines, no attention, just a life that, from the outside, looked completely ordinary. And that's exactly what makes this story so difficult to process, because when people later tried to understand what happened, they didn't see a criminal profile. They saw someone they recognized, someone familiar, someone who reminded them of their own father, their neighbor, or even themselves. Gary wasn't known for anger. He wasn't known for violence. If anything, he was known for being steady, dependable, the kind of person you trust without thinking about it. But the center of his world wasn't his job or his routine. It was his family, more specifically, his son. Everything in Gary's life revolved around protecting, guiding, and being present for that child. The relationship wasn't distant or cold. It was close, active, involved. The kind of bond that doesn't need to be explained because it's felt in small, everyday moments. Rides to practice, conversations at the dinner table, the quiet understanding that a parent is always there, even when nothing is said. And that's where the shift begins, because when people imagine extreme actions, they often picture extreme personalities. But reality doesn't work that way. Sometimes the most irreversible decisions come from the most ordinary people, placed in situations they were never built to handle. Situations that don't give you time to think clearly. Situations that don't ask who you are, only what you're willing to do. At that point, the question stops being about personality. It becomes about limits. What would it take to push someone like Gary past his own? What kind of event could take a man with no history of violence and place him at the center of something the entire country would later watch, analyze, and debate for decades? To understand that, you have to look at what entered his life next, because this story doesn't begin with a public moment. It begins with something far more personal, something that doesn't happen in front of cameras, something that starts quietly and then changes everything. It didn't start with chaos. It started the way moments like this often do, quietly, without warning, in the middle of a normal day. There was no signal that anything was about to go wrong, no visible shift in the routine, just a child who was supposed to be safe, and then suddenly wasn't. When Jeff Doucet entered the picture, nothing about him immediately triggered alarm. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone who had already established a level of trust, someone who had access, proximity, and the ability to move without raising suspicion. And that's what made the situation so dangerous, because the most devastating events aren't always forced. They're allowed in, quietly, under the appearance of normalcy. The day Gary's son disappeared didn't come with clear answers. At first, it was confusion, then concern, and then something heavier began to settle in. The realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't a delay, something had gone wrong. Hours began to stretch. Every passing minute carried more weight than the last. Calls were made, questions were asked. And with each unanswered question, the pressure inside that family grew. Not loud, not explosive, but suffocating. The kind of pressure that builds in silence, where your mind begins to race faster than reality can keep up. When authorities finally began to understand what had happened, the situation escalated quickly. What they uncovered wasn't just a disappearance, it was a calculated act. A line had already been crossed. Gary wasn't standing in front of cameras at this point. He wasn't making decisions in public. He was inside a reality most people will never experience. A parent confronting the possibility that their child has been taken, hurt, and placed in the hands of someone they trusted. That's not a moment you prepare for. That's not a situation you think through logically. It's something that hits all at once, collapsing any sense of control you thought you had. And when his son was eventually found, alive but deeply affected by what had happened, the relief didn't come clean. It came mixed with something else, something far more complicated, because survival doesn't erase what led up to it. It doesn't undo the fear, the violation, or the knowledge of what could have happened if things had gone differently. That's where the internal shift begins, not in a single explosive moment, but in the slow realization that the world you trusted just proved it can break without warning. Gary now knew exactly who was responsible. He knew what had been done, and more importantly, he knew that the person behind it was still alive, still moving through the system, still existing in a world that now felt completely different from the one he had lived in just days before. At that point, the situation becomes something else entirely. It's no longer about confusion. It's no longer about finding answers. It's about what comes next. And that's where most people assume the story follows a predictable path: arrest, charges, courtrooms, justice handled within the system. But this case didn't stay inside that structure, because while the legal process was moving forward, something else was happening at the same time. Something quieter, more personal, and far more difficult to measure. Gary wasn't speaking publicly. He wasn't making statements. But internally, a line had already been crossed. Not the kind you see, the kind you feel. The kind that changes how you look at everything moving forward. And when the moment finally came, the one that would be captured, broadcast, and replayed for decades, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from everything that had already built up beneath the surface. The fear, the anger, the helplessness, the knowledge that no outcome could fully restore what had been taken. So when people later watched those few seconds on television, what they were really seeing wasn't just a reaction. They were seeing the result of everything that led up to it. And by then, the situation had already moved beyond anything simple. Because now it wasn't just about what had been done. It was about what someone might feel justified doing in response. And that's the part that makes this story impossible to ignore. By the time that day arrived, everything was already in motion. Law enforcement had coordinated the transfer, reporters had been tipped off. Cameras were set, angles chosen, microphones ready. It wasn't chaos, it was controlled, procedural, expected. Another suspect being moved through a public space, another moment that would briefly make the news and then disappear. Inside the terminal at the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, people stood where they normally would, some watching, most not. Conversations continued, footsteps echoed. Nothing about the environment suggested that this would become one of the most replayed moments in American television history. And then there was Gary Plauché. He wasn't surrounded by cameras. He wasn't being questioned. He wasn't even the focus of anyone's attention. He stood off to the side, positioned just far enough to blend into the background, just close enough to see everything clearly. No raised voice, no visible tension. If you had walked past him in that moment, you wouldn't have stopped. You wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. And that's what makes what followed so unsettling. Because when the officers finally appeared, escorting Jeff Doucet through the terminal, all attention shifted to them. Cameras locked in, reporters leaned forward, every lens pointed at the man in custody. No one was looking at Gary, not yet. The distance between them closed quickly, a few steps, then a few more. The sound of movement, the quiet murmur of voices, the mechanical hum of recording equipment, all of it continued as if nothing was about to change. And then, in less than a second, it did. Gary moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that signaled what was about to happen. Just a small, deliberate step forward, close enough that there was no space left between decision and action. He reached, drew a concealed handgun, and fired a single shot into Doucet's head at point-blank range. The sound cut through everything. Conversation stopped mid-word. The rhythm of the terminal collapsed instantly into confusion. For a split second, no one processed what had just happened. Then the reaction hit all at once. Officers lunged, cameras jolted, people froze, then scattered. But the moment itself, the action, was already over. One decision, one movement, one irreversible outcome, and it had all been captured clean, uninterrupted. No cuts, no edits, no interpretation needed. Just reality, unfolding faster than anyone could stop it. Gary didn't run. He didn't resist. As officers forced him to the ground, he offered no struggle beyond the instinctive tension of the moment. It was as if the action itself had been the only thing left to complete. Around him, the environment had completely shifted. What seconds ago was a routine escort had turned into a scene that no one present would ever forget. Reporters who came expecting a statement now had something far more powerful, something raw, something immediate, something that would travel far beyond that airport within hours. Because this wasn't just an incident, it was a moment that would be broadcast across the country, replayed on televisions, discussed in homes, debated in public spaces, and the reaction didn't follow the pattern most people would expect. It wasn't just shock, it wasn't just condemnation, it was something far more divided, because while the footage showed exactly what happened, it didn't tell people how to feel about it. That part came later, and when it did, it revealed something deeper, not just about Gary, but about the people watching, because now the question was no longer what happened. Everyone had seen that. The real question was much harder to answer. What do you do with a moment like this, when you understand exactly why it happened? By the time the legal system fully took control of the case, the footage had already escaped the courtroom. It was no longer just evidence. It had become a public experience. People had watched it, replayed it, slowed it down, debated every frame. And long before a judge ever spoke, the world had already formed its own verdict in silence, one that didn't match what the law was about to decide. In court, however, emotion doesn't lead. Procedure does. Gary Plauché was charged in connection with the death of Jeff Doucet. The state could not ignore what the law clearly defined as a crime. A life had been taken in a public space, in a moment that left no room for ambiguity in legal terms. But from the very beginning, something unusual happened in the way this case unfolded. There was no wave of public fear surrounding Gary, no widespread demand for harsh punishment, no unified call for retribution. Instead, something else took its place. Understanding, and for many, something dangerously close to agreement. Inside the courtroom, the facts were not in dispute. The footage had already done what testimony usually does. It established sequence. It established identity. It established intent in the eyes of the law. What remained was interpretation. Gary Plauché did not present himself as a man trying to escape responsibility. He did not attempt to rewrite what happened or deny it in vague language. His legal position was not built on confusion. It was built on context. A father, a child, a violation that had already shattered a family before the legal system ever stepped in. When the case moved toward resolution, Gary ultimately entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter. The court sentenced him to a suspended prison term and probation, along with counseling requirements, an outcome that reflected something rare in cases of this nature. The law acknowledged the act, but it also, in its own way, acknowledged the circumstances surrounding it. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was anything but unified. News coverage turned into national conversation. Television hosts replayed the footage not once, but repeatedly, each time asking the same question in different forms. Was this justice or something else entirely? In living rooms across America, people were split in ways that surprised even themselves. Some saw a line that should never be crossed under any circumstance. They spoke about the danger of personal vengeance replacing legal process, about what happens to society when individuals decide outcomes on their own terms. To them, the footage was not heroic. It was a warning. But another group saw something very different. They saw a father who had already lived through a system that, in their view, had failed to act fast enough to prevent irreversible harm. They saw grief transformed into action, not as a celebration, but as an outcome they understood on a human level, even if they couldn't fully justify it in legal terms. And that's where the discomfort truly began, because this wasn't a simple case of right versus wrong. It was a collision between two systems that are supposed to align, but sometimes don't. Law and human instinct. The most unsettling part for many wasn't what Gary did. It was the fact that, in imagining themselves in the same position, they weren't entirely sure what they would have done differently. That thought alone divided people more than the event itself. As debates continued, the story slowly stopped being about one man in an airport. It became something larger, a reflection of how fragile the boundary is between justice defined by institutions and justice felt in the moment. And the further people moved away from the event, the more one truth remained impossible to ignore. The footage didn't just capture an act. It captured a reaction most people fear they might understand more than they want to admit. In the end, the court delivered its sentence. The case was closed in legal terms. The system moved forward, as it always does. But outside that system, the world stayed stuck on something far less simple. Because even after all the arguments faded, even after the headlines moved on, one question refused to disappear. The law said one thing, but the reaction of millions said something else entirely. And when those two realities don't match, nothing feels fully resolved. Not really. And that leaves you with the only question that never needed a courtroom to exist. When everything collapses in a single moment, do you trust the system to decide what justice is? Or do you admit that in that exact second, you might not think like the system at all? The law gave its answer, but the world felt another. And now the decision you make about that difference says more than the story itself ever could.